The war had left the galaxy fractured, with treaties signed in haste and alliances formed out of desperation. Humanity, once considered a fledgling race among the stars, had earned its place not through power or influence, but through resilience and ingenuity. It was in this fragile peace that a small medical frigate, the Haven, floated in orbit above a war-torn planet. Its crew, a modest collection of medics and technicians, worked tirelessly to heal those left in the aftermath of battle, regardless of their species or allegiance. Dr. Adrian, a human medic known for his calm demeanor and steady hands, was tending to a wounded soldier when the distress call came through. The voice on the other end was trembling, the universal translator catching the faintest hint of fear. "This is Princess, requesting assistance. Please, someone, help." The transmission was weak, the signal barely holding together. Adrian paused, his brow furrowing as he exchanged a glance with his colleague. "A princess?" "Out here." The coordinates were transmitted alongside the plea, leading to a remote forested area on the planet below. The team debated briefly. It could be a trap, a remnant of the war seeking to exploit their mercy. But Adrian's gut told him otherwise. Something in her voice. It wasn't just desperation. It was raw, unfiltered vulnerability. Against the cautious advice of the others, he volunteered to go. The shuttle ride down was turbulent, the atmosphere thick with residual energy from orbital strikes. Adrian gripped the controls tightly, guiding the craft through the swirling clouds and into the dense forest below. The landing was rough, branches scraping against the hull as the shuttle settled onto uneven ground. He grabbed his med kit and stepped into the alien wilderness, the air thick with humidity and the distant hum of unfamiliar wildlife. It didn't take long to find her. She was slumped against the base of a massive tree, her regal attire torn and stained with blood. Her skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, an iridescent blue that seemed to ripple with her shallow breaths. Her eyes, large and expressive, snapped open as he approached, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. She tried to push herself up, but her strength failed her, and she collapsed back with a muffled cry. "Stay still," Adrian said gently, kneeling beside her. His voice was calm but firm, the way he'd spoken to countless patients before. She flinched at first, her gaze darting to the syringe in his hand, but he held it up for her to see. "It's a painkiller. You're hurt badly, but I'm here to help." She hesitated, her breaths shallow and quick, but eventually gave a faint nod. Adrian worked quickly, administering the injection and beginning to assess her injuries. Her arm was fractured, her ribs likely cracked, and there was a deep gash along her side that was dangerously close to becoming infected. As he worked, she watched him intently, her distrust gradually giving way to something softer. "Why?" she whispered after a long silence. Her voice was weak but carried an undeniable weight. "Why are you helping me?" Adrian paused, glancing up from his work. "Because you need help," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She looked at him as though she couldn't quite believe his words. "You don't even know who I am." "No," he admitted, "but I know you're alive. And that's all I need to know." Her eyes glistened, but she quickly turned her head away, blinking rapidly. Adrian pretended not to notice, focusing instead on cleaning and stitching the wound at her side. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional hiss of a med spray or the distant calls of alien creatures in the forest. He didn't press her for details, didn't ask why a princess was alone and injured on a battlefield. He figured she'd tell him when she was ready. It wasn't until he was wrapping a bandage around her arm that she finally spoke again. I... I was supposed to negotiate peace, she said quietly, her voice tinged with bitterness. But they ambushed us. My guards, my entourage. They're all gone. Adrian didn't respond immediately, his hands working methodically. He'd seen too much loss to offer hollow reassurances. Instead, he said, "You're still here. That means something." She looked at him sharply, as if searching for mockery in his words, but found none. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, her posture relaxed slightly. It was a small victory, but Adrian took it. As he finished his work, he realized the forest had grown eerily quiet. The hum of wildlife had faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Adrian's eyes darted to the treetops, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. He stood, positioning himself between the princess and the direction his gut told him danger was coming from. "What is it?" she asked, her voice laced with alarm. "We're not alone," Adrian said grimly. He reached for the sidearm holstered at his waist, his fingers tightening around the grip. The princess tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her side. Before she could protest, a low growl echoed through the trees, followed by the rustling of leaves. Figures emerged from the shadows, mercenaries, their armor scuffed and their weapons trained on Adrian and the princess. Their leader, a hulking figure with a scar running down his face, sneered as he stepped forward. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like we found our runaway princess." Adrian's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He positioned himself more firmly in front of her, raising his weapon. "She's injured. Let her go." The mercenary laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "And let her slip through our fingers again. Not a chance, medic." He spat the word like an insult, as though Adrian's profession was a weakness. "Step aside. You don't need to die for this." Adrian didn't move. "You're not taking her." His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He had no illusions about his chances against a squad of armed mercenaries. But he also knew he couldn't live with himself if he walked away. The mercenary leader's expression darkened, and he raised his rifle. "Your funeral." Time seemed to slow as Adrian tightened his grip on his weapon, his mind calculating and discarding possible outcomes. Behind him, the princess whispered something in a language he didn't understand, her voice filled with urgency. A faint glow began to emanate from her, casting long, flickering shadows across the forest floor. Adrian risked a glance back, his eyes widening as he saw the light radiating from her. It wasn't just light, it was power, raw and uncontained. The mercenaries hesitated, their confidence faltering as the glow grew brighter, more intense. The leader barked a command, but it was too late. The forest erupted into chaos as the energy surged outward, blinding and unstoppable. The princess's tears sparkled under the dim light of the medical bay, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. The human medic, still kneeling at her side, carefully removed his gloves, his hands trembling slightly. He couldn't understand why her reaction struck him so deeply. The princess, regal even in her pain, was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale lavender hue that caught the light in a way that was almost ethereal. Her large, luminous eyes looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of gratitude and sorrow, and he felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest. He'd only done his duty, or so he told himself. The emergency beacon had been clear, a life hung in the balance. It wasn't until he boarded the alien vessel and saw her crumpled form that he realized how extraordinary this situation was. Her attendants, their expressions unreadable, had parted to let him through, their trust in his abilities unmistakable despite the language barrier. They had no choice but to rely on him, a mere human, to save someone so precious to them. The weight of that responsibility had been overwhelming, but now, seeing her alive and conscious, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The princess reached out a delicate hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his arm. Her touch was impossibly light, almost like a whisper against his skin. "Why?" she asked, her voice melodic yet heavy with emotion. Her question took him by surprise. He stared at her, unsure how to respond. "Why?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "You didn't have to." She trailed off, as if the words were too difficult to say. Her attendants shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that the medic couldn't decipher. It was clear they were just as bewildered by the situation as he was. "Because I could," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "Because you needed help." The simplicity of his answer seemed to catch her off guard. Her luminous eyes widened slightly, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. He wanted to say more, to explain that it was simply what he'd been trained to do, that saving lives was his purpose. But something about her gaze made him hold back. It was as if she saw through his words, as if she understood the deeper truth he hadn't yet acknowledged himself. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. The medic glanced at the attendants, wondering if he had overstepped some invisible boundary. Their expressions remained unreadable, but none of them moved to intervene. The princess, meanwhile, seemed lost in thought. Her hand lingered on his arm for a moment longer before she withdrew it, folding it neatly in her lap. She straightened her posture, the regal demeanor returning as if she'd donned a mask. "You are unlike any human I have encountered," she said softly. Her voice carried an air of formality now, but there was a vulnerability beneath it that hadn't been there before. The medic wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded. He could feel the weight of her gaze, studying him as though he were some enigma she couldn't quite unravel. Before he could think of something to say, the ship's lights flickered and a low hum reverberated through the walls. The attendants tensed immediately, their hands hovering near the strange devices strapped to their sides. The princess's expression hardened, and she turned to one of them, speaking rapidly in her native tongue. The medic couldn't understand the words, but the urgency in her tone was unmistakable. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. None of the attendants answered him. Instead, the princess rose to her feet, her movements graceful despite the lingering effects of her injury. She turned to face him, her expression a mixture of determination and concern. "We are not safe here," she said, her voice firm. "You must come with us." The medic blinked, taken aback. "What? Why? What's going on?" The princess didn't answer right away. She glanced at her attendants, who seemed to be waiting for her command. After a moment, she turned back to him, her gaze steady. "You saved my life," she said. "Now I must ensure that yours is not lost because of it." Her words sent a chill down his spine. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but before he could, the ship's lights flickered again, and the hum grew louder. The attendants moved quickly, surrounding the princess in a protective formation. One of them gestured for the medic to follow, their expression leaving no room for argument. The medic hesitated, his mind racing. He'd signed up for this mission expecting the unexpected, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. Still, the urgency in the princess's voice and the tense atmosphere left him little choice. He nodded and followed them, his heart pounding in his chest. They led him through the ship's corridors, the walls pulsing faintly with an otherworldly light. The medic couldn't shake the feeling that the ship itself was alive, reacting to the tension that filled the air. The princess walked ahead of him, her posture rigid, her head held high. She didn't look back, but he could sense her awareness of his presence. As they moved deeper into the ship, the medic's thoughts raced. Who were these people? Why had they trusted him to save her? And what danger were they now facing? The questions swirled in his mind, but he knew better than to ask them now. The princess's earlier words replayed in his head, and he couldn't help but wonder what she'd meant. Why would his life be at risk because he'd saved hers? They reached a chamber that was unlike any he'd seen before. The walls shimmered with a soft golden light, and strange symbols etched into the surfaces glowed faintly. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, atop which rested a small, crystalline object. The princess approached it, her expression unreadable. She placed her hand on the crystal, and a series of symbols lit up beneath her touch. "What is that?" the medic asked, unable to contain his curiosity. The princess turned to him, her gaze serious. "It is our only hope," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that made his stomach tighten. Before he could ask her to explain, the ship shook violently, nearly knocking him off his feet. The attendants drew their weapons, their movements swift and practiced. "We are out of time," Princess said, her voice steady despite the chaos. She turned to the medic, her expression softening for just a moment. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens, do not leave my side." The medic nodded, his throat dry. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he knew one thing for certain: his life had just become infinitely more complicated. Despite the frantic pace of their escape, the tension between the human medic and the alien princess was palpable. She could sense his unease, but there was a steadiness in his actions that comforted her. The forest around them seemed alive, the glowing flora reacting to their movements as if watching their every step. The hum of distant patrols grew louder, each sound pressing them to move faster. They didn't speak much, their breaths too labored from the climb, but every glance they exchanged spoke volumes. The medic's thoughts were racing. He hadn't planned for this, any of it. His only intention had been to provide aid to a wounded individual, but now he found himself at the center of a diplomatic storm. The princess's injuries were severe, but his makeshift medical expertise had held her together. What worried him more was her fragile emotional state. She'd been through something traumatic, and though she tried to hide it behind a stoic facade, her trembling hands betrayed her. They reached a small clearing that was shielded from the sky by thick, interwoven branches. It wasn't much, but it would provide cover while they regrouped. The medic motioned for her to sit while he scanned the area with his handheld device. "No immediate signs of danger. For now, we'll rest here for a moment," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need to check your bandages." She hesitated but eventually nodded, her luminous eyes watching him cautiously. He worked quickly, peeling back the makeshift dressings to inspect the wound on her side. The antiseptic he'd used earlier had done its job, but the strain of their escape was reopening the edges. She winced but didn't pull away. "You're going to have to trust me," he said, meeting her gaze. "I need you to stay still." She didn't reply, but there was a flicker of something in her expression, not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of it. He worked silently, applying a fresh dressing and using what little adhesive he had left to secure it. His fingers brushed against her skin, and for a brief moment, he felt the faint pulse of her energy, a warmth that seemed to radiate from within her. "Thank you," she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady but tinged with exhaustion. "You didn't have to do this." He paused, his hands stilling for a moment. I couldn't just leave you there. That's not who I am." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the ground. "You don't understand. Helping me puts you in danger. They won't stop until they find me and anyone who aids me. Then we'll make sure they don't find us," he said with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "But you need to tell me what we're dealing with. Who are they? And why are they after you?" She hesitated again, as if weighing whether to share the truth. Finally, she sighed. "They're not just after me. They want what I represent. My people, my family. We're custodians of something ancient, something powerful. It's meant to protect, to preserve balance. But in the wrong hands." Her voice trailed off, and she shuddered. He frowned, trying to piece together her cryptic explanation. "And they think you're the key to it." She nodded. "I'm the last one left who knows how to access it. If they capture me." She didn't finish the sentence, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. The medic sat back, running a hand through his hair. This was far bigger than he'd anticipated. He'd thought he was just helping a stranded traveler, but now he was entangled in something that could have galaxy-wide implication. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. She needed help, and he couldn't turn his back on her. "All right," he said after a moment. "We'll figure this out. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." Her eyes widened slightly. "You're not going to leave me." "Not a chance," he replied firmly. "We're in this together now." For the first time, a small, tentative smile crossed her face. It was fleeting, but it was enough to bolster his resolve. He stood and extended a hand to her. "Let's move. They're probably tracking us, and we can't stay here too long." As they continued their journey, the forest seemed to close in around them, the dense foliage creating an almost oppressive atmosphere. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a creature, set them on edge. The medic kept his senses sharp, his hand never straying far from the weapon he'd salvaged earlier. He wasn't a soldier, but he'd learned enough in his years of fieldwork to know how to defend himself. The princess, too, seemed to grow more alert. Despite her injuries, there was a grace to her movements, an otherworldly presence that hinted at her royal lineage. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a keen awareness. It was clear she wasn't just a helpless victim, she was a survivor. But the danger wasn't just external. The medic could feel the weight of the secret she carried, the burden of being the last of her kind. It was a heavy responsibility, one that she'd been forced to bear alone. And now, by choosing to help her, he'd taken on some of that weight himself. As night fell, they found shelter in a small cave tucked away behind a waterfall. The sound of rushing water provided a comforting backdrop, masking any noises that might give away their location. The medic built a small fire, its flickering light casting shadows on the cave walls. They sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between them growing heavier. Finally, the princess spoke. "You asked why they want me. It's not just about the knowledge I have. It's about what I can do." He looked at her, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then held out her hand. A soft, golden light began to emanate from her palm, illuminating the cave. It was warm and soothing, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped them for most of the day. "This energy, it's part of me. It's part of my people. It can heal, protect, even create. But it can also destroy. That's why they want it. They want to harness it for their own purposes." The medic stared at the light, both awed and uneasy. He'd seen incredible things in his line of work, but this was unlike anything he'd encountered before. "And you can control it?" She nodded. "To an extent. But it's not just about control. It's about intention. If someone with darkness in their heart tries to use it." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear. He leaned back against the cave wall, his mind racing. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about protecting something far greater. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He'd stumbled into this situation by chance, but now he was determined to see it through. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "One step at a time." She looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and determination. "Thank you for everything." He shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let's just focus on staying alive. We can worry about saving the galaxy later." But even as they shared a brief moment of levity, the medic couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The shadows outside the cave seemed to grow darker, and the hum of distant patrols drew ever closer. The real fight was still ahead, and he knew it would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The forest seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, a symphony of alien life enveloping them in its relentless energy. The medic's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the makeshift splint on the princess's leg, the weight of her situation bearing down on him. The urgency in her luminous eyes was unmistakable, but there was something more there now, a flicker of unease, as though she sensed something approaching long before he could. The medic's gut tightened, his instincts telling him to trust her reaction. Before he could question her further, a distant rumble reached their ears, low and menacing like thunder rolling across a stormy sea. It wasn't the natural sounds of the forest this time. This was mechanical, deliberate. The princess's gaze darted toward the direction of the sound, her expression shifting from apprehension to dread. She said something in her language, the melodic tones now sharp with urgency, and pointed toward a dense thicket of glowing flora. "Hide," the medic guessed, his voice low. She nodded emphatically, her usually graceful demeanor frayed by desperation. Not waiting for an explanation, he helped her to her feet, doing his best to support her weight as they moved toward the thicket. The soft light emitted by the plants cast eerie patterns on their faces as they crouched low, their breaths shallow and synchronized in the tense quiet. The noise grew louder, resolving into the unmistakable hum of engines. The medic's heart raced as he realized what this could mean. Rescue? Reinforcements? But one glance at the princess told him otherwise. Her wide, fearful eyes and the way she gripped his arm with trembling fingers made it clear, whatever was coming, it was not their salvation. A shadow fell over the clearing they had just vacated. The medic peeked through the gaps in the foliage, his pulse pounding in his ears. A sleek, obsidian craft descended with an unnatural grace, its surface rippling like liquid under the moonlight. It landed silently, but the presence it exuded was anything but subtle. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on them as figures emerged from the craft. They moved with a predatory elegance, their armor glinting faintly as if it absorbed and refracted the ambient light. The princess's grip on his arm tightened, and she whispered a single word in his ear. The translation module struggled for a moment before rendering it, "Hunters." The medic's mind raced. These weren't her people, nor were they from any faction he'd encountered during his time in the galaxy. Their movements were methodical, scanning the area with devices that emitted a faint, eerie glow. One of them paused, tilting its head as if listening to something unseen. The medic held his breath, his hand instinctively moving to the sidearm holstered at his hip. He'd barely used it before, relying on his medical skills rather than combat training. But now, the weight of the weapon felt both reassuring and terrifying. The princess's whispered instructions came fast and urgent. Though the translation module couldn't keep up entirely, he understood the gist. Stay silent, don't engage, and above all, don't let them see her. The implication was clear. These hunters weren't here for him. They were here for her. Just when he thought the tension couldn't escalate further, one of the hunters raised a device and emitted a sharp, pulsating signal. The sound sliced through the forest, causing the flora around them to recoil as if in pain. The princess winced, clutching her head, and the medic quickly pulled her closer, shielding her as best he could. The device's signal seemed to probe the environment, searching, reaching until it stopped abruptly. The hunter turned in their direction. The medic's blood ran cold. They had been found. Before he could think of their next move, the princess acted. She reached into the folds of her garment and produced a small crystalline object that pulsed faintly with its own light. With a swift, deliberate motion, she pressed it into the medic's hand, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that left no room for argument. She murmured something, her tone resolute, and then pushed him back into the deeper shadows of the thicket. "No," he whispered fiercely, refusing to leave her behind. But she shook her head, her expression a mixture of determination and sorrow. Whatever this object was, it was clearly important, and whatever she planned to do next, it was dangerous. The hunters advanced, their movements swift and coordinated. The princess stepped forward, her injured leg barely holding her weight, and raised her arms in what seemed to be a gesture of surrender. The medic's heart twisted in his chest as he realized her intent. She was drawing them away from him, from whatever it was she had just entrusted to his care. The lead hunter approached her, its weapon aimed but not firing. There was a tense pause as they seemed to communicate, though no words were spoken aloud. The princess's stance was regal despite her injury, her gaze unyielding even in the face of such a threat. The medic could only watch, frozen with a mix of fear and helplessness, as she engaged them in what appeared to be a standoff. Then, without warning, the hunter closest to her lunged. The princess moved with surprising speed, her hands glowing with a sudden burst of energy that repelled the attacker. The medic's eyes widened. This was a side of her he hadn't seen before, a raw display of power that hinted at the depth of her abilities. But it was clear she was outnumbered and outmatched. The hunters regrouped quickly, their movements fluid and relentless. One of them activated a device on its wrist, and the air around the princess shimmered ominously. She staggered, the glow in her hands faltering as the device's effect took hold. The medic's grip tightened around the crystal she'd given him, a surge of determination coursing through him. He couldn't just stand by and watch her be taken. Summoning every ounce of courage, he emerged from the shadows, his sidearm raised. The hunters turned toward him, their weapons immediately trained on his figure. The princess's eyes widened in shock and alarm, but there was no time for her to protest. The medic took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at him. "Let her go," he demanded, his finger hovering over the trigger. The words sounded braver than he felt, but he refused to back down. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the tension crackling like static in the air. The lead hunter tilted its head, studying him with what almost seemed like curiosity. It stepped forward, its weapon lowering slightly, and spoke in a voice that was disturbingly human-like. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." The medic's jaw tightened. "I know enough," he retorted, his gaze flicking briefly to the princess. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of hope and despair. Whatever was about to happen, he knew this was a turning point, and there was no going back. The sudden stillness in the clearing was shattered as the skies above began to shimmer. It was no longer just the alien princess and the medic facing the alien forces. The strange signals from the medic's earlier communication device had somehow triggered a response. A fleet of Earth's defense vessels emerged from the atmosphere, sleek and bristling with energy weapons. The sight sent a ripple of unease through the alien soldiers, their disciplined formation faltering for the first time. The medic's heart was pounding. He hadn't expected a response, let alone such an overwhelming one. But there was no time to marvel. The ground beneath them trembled, and he realized this was no rescue mission. Earth's forces had come to neutralize a perceived threat, and they didn't distinguish between friend or foe on alien soil. He turned to the princess, her face a mix of awe and terror, and shouted over the rising cacophony. "We have to move. They won't spare us either." The princess hesitated, looking at her people who were now scrambling, disoriented by the arrival of Earth's fleet. A pang of guilt flashed across her face, but she nodded. Together, they darted toward the dense jungle, hoping to escape the chaos. The medic glanced back and saw the first volley of Earth's weapons streak toward the clearing, lighting up the sky with a fiery brilliance. The ground shook violently as explosions tore through the alien forces, scattering them like leaves in a storm. Just as they reached the cover of the trees, a deafening roar split the air. From the depths of the alien stronghold, a massive, biomechanical construct emerged. It was a towering sentinel, pulsating with energy and wielding weapons unlike anything the medic had ever seen. Its appearance turned the tide of battle instantly, its sheer presence rallying the alien forces. The princess stopped abruptly, her eyes wide with recognition. "It's the Guardian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was meant to protect us, but it's been reprogrammed to destroy anyone who stands against the regime." The medic grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "Then we need to stay far away from it." But she shook her head. "No, we can't run anymore. If the Guardian isn't stopped, it will hunt us to the ends of the galaxy." She turned to him, her expression resolute. "You saved me. Now, it's my turn to save all of us." Before he could protest, she stepped forward, her hands glowing with the same energy that had healed her earlier. The Guardian paused, its massive frame towering over the battlefield. It seemed to recognize her, its weapons lowering slightly, but then it emitted a guttural mechanical growl, resuming its advance. The medic's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop this without sacrificing her. He reached for the device he had used earlier to summon Earth's fleet. Perhaps it could interfere with the Guardian's systems. As the princess confronted the colossal machine, he frantically adjusted the device's settings, trying to sync with the Guardian's signal. His hands shook, but he couldn't afford to fail. The princess stood her ground, her glowing hands raised as she chanted in her native tongue. The Guardian hesitated again, its movements becoming erratic. It was fighting against its programming, the princess's energy connecting with its core. But the effort was taking a toll on her. She staggered, the glow around her dimming. "Hold on," the medic shouted, his fingers flying over the device's interface. Finally, he found it a frequency that matched the Guardian's. He activated it, sending a pulse that caused the massive construct to freeze. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final surge of energy, the princess collapsed, and the Guardian let out a deafening roar before its body crumbled, its systems shutting down permanently. The battlefield fell silent, the alien forces retreating in disarray as Earth's fleet hovered menacingly above. The medic rushed to the princess's side, his heart sinking as he saw how pale she had become. But her chest rose and fell weakly. She was alive. Relief washed over him as he lifted her into his arms, carrying her away from the destruction. As they reached a safe distance, a final transmission came through on his device. It was a warning from Earth's fleet. They were preparing to wipe out the entire area to ensure no threats remained. Time was running out. He looked down at the princess, her eyes fluttering open. "We need to leave now," he said urgently. She nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. "There's a ship hidden nearby. It's how I escaped before. It can take us far from here." With her guidance, they found the hidden vessel, a sleek alien craft that hummed to life as they approached. The medic strapped her into the co-pilot's seat, his hands moving instinctively over the controls as if the ship itself was guiding him. As the engines roared to life, Earth's fleet began their final assault, the ground erupting in flames behind them. The ship shot into the sky, narrowly avoiding the destruction below. The medic's breath came in ragged gasps as he steered the vessel away from the planet, the stars stretching out before them. Beside him, the princess reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with both gratitude and sorrow. "You've risked everything for me." He met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "We're not done yet. There's still a galaxy out there that needs saving." As the ship disappeared into the vast expanse of space, neither of them noticed the small, blinking device left behind in the wreckage, a tracker, silently transmitting their location to an unknown force. As the light of the dual moons dimmed and the alien winds carried whispers of the recent battle, the forest began to quiet, though its silence felt uneasy. The human medic stood on the edge of the devastated clearing, his breath still heavy as adrenaline ebbed from his system. The alien princess, now free from the grip of the technology that had nearly cost her life, turned her gaze toward him, her luminous eyes filled with both gratitude and uncertainty. There was something about the way she looked at him that spoke beyond language, beyond cultures, and understanding that, despite the differences in their origins, they had fought for the same purpose, survival, and something deeper, hope. The princess stepped forward, her movements cautious but deliberate. Her people, now gathering from the shadows, began to approach the clearing as well. Their elegant forms moved with a mixture of reverence and hesitation. It was clear they were torn between their awe at her survival and the strange human who had made it possible. One of the elders broke from the crowd, his expression unreadable as he approached the princess and the medic. His voice, melodic and strong, filled the air with an alien language that carried the weight of generations. The princess listened, then responded with a strength that hadn't been there before. She gestured toward the medic, her tone firm and respectful. Whatever she said, it seemed to settle the unease among her people. The elder nodded, his expression softening as he looked at the human. It was clear that, while the trust was tentative, the actions of the medic had earned him something rare: acceptance, if only for the moment. The medic felt a mix of relief and apprehension. While the immediate danger seemed to have passed, he knew the larger questions remained unanswered. How would the princess's people react in the long term to this unprecedented alliance? Would humanity's involvement in this world, even if unintentional, lead to greater conflict or understanding? He glanced at the princess, who was now addressing her people with a commanding presence. Her voice carried across the clearing, and he could feel the tension easing with each word she spoke. As the crowd began to disperse, the princess turned back to him. She spoke in halting English, her grasp of the language still shaky but determined. "You save me," she said, her words deliberate and heavy with meaning. "Not just my life, our hope." The medic felt the weight of her words settle over him. He wanted to respond, to convey the complexities of what had driven him to act. But before he could, the princess placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that transcended words. Her touch was light, but resolute, and in that moment, he understood that his actions had bridged a gap that no amount of diplomacy or technology could have achieved. Over the next few days, the medic was welcomed, albeit cautiously, into the heart of their settlement. The alien city, hidden deep within the forest, was a marvel of organic architecture, blending seamlessly with the natural environment. Towering structures made of bioluminescent materials pulsed gently in rhythm with the life around them, and pathways wound through the trees like veins in a living organism. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a testament to a civilization that had thrived in harmony with its world. The princess took it upon herself to guide him, explaining their customs and history as best she could. Her people had once been a thriving empire, but centuries of internal strife and external threats had left them fractured and vulnerable. The device that had nearly taken her life was a remnant of a darker time, a weapon created in desperation to fend off an ancient enemy. Its activation had been unintentional, a tragic mistake by a faction within her people who believed that the past was the only way to secure their future. As the days turned into weeks, the medic began to see the complexities of their situation. The princess was not just a figurehead. She was a symbol of unity for a people on the brink of collapse. Her survival had reignited a spark of hope, but it was fragile, and the path forward was uncertain. He also learned that his arrival had been both a blessing and a challenge. While some saw him as a savior, others viewed him as a reminder of the outside world, a world that many feared would bring destruction. Despite the challenges, the bond between the medic and the princess grew stronger. They shared stories, their conversations often punctuated by laughter as they struggled to bridge their linguistic and cultural gaps. She showed him the beauty of her world, from the glowing rivers that flowed like liquid light to the towering spires of crystal that resonated with the songs of the wind. In return, he shared glimpses of Earth, its oceans, its mountains, its flawed but vibrant humanity. But even as their friendship deepened, shadows lingered on the horizon. The faction responsible for activating the ancient device had not been silenced. They saw the princess's survival as a threat to their vision of a stronger, more isolated future. Rumors of their movements reached the settlement, and the tension among her people grew palpable. The climax came on a night when the twin moons hung low in the sky, their light casting eerie shadows across the city. The medic and the princess were on one of the highest platforms, overlooking the glowing expanse of their world. She was speaking of her hopes for her people, her voice filled with a quiet determination when the first explosion shattered the night. The attack was swift and brutal. The rebel faction had infiltrated the city, their goal clear: to eliminate the princess and seize control. The medic found himself thrust into the chaos, his instincts as a healer clashing with the need to defend. He stayed by the princess's side, using his medical knowledge to aid the injured and his resolve to protect her from harm. The battle was a blur of light and sound, but in the end, the rebels were defeated. The princess stood tall, her presence commanding even in the aftermath of destruction. She addressed her people with a voice that carried the weight of their shared pain and their shared hope. Her words resonated deeply, and for the first time, the fractures within her society began to heal. In the days that followed, the city began to rebuild. The princess's leadership had been solidified, and her people rallied around her with a newfound sense of unity. The medic knew that his role in their story was coming to an end. He had done what he could, and now it was time for her people to shape their own future. On the day of his departure, the princess walked with him to the edge of the forest. She presented him with a small, glowing crystal, a token of gratitude and a reminder of the bond they had forged. "You changed more than you know," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Not just for me, but for all of us." The medic nodded, unable to find the words to express the depth of his own feelings. As he stepped onto the ship that would take him back to Earth, he looked back one last time. The princess stood tall among her people, her presence a beacon of hope in a world that had faced so much darkness. As the ship lifted off, the medic felt a sense of closure. He had come to this world by chance, but he left knowing that his actions had made a difference. The bond he had formed with the princess and her people was a reminder of the potential for connection and understanding, even across the vastness of space. And as the stars stretched out before him, he couldn't help but wonder what other stories the universe held, waiting to be written.